Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here. Good morning. Welcome to the 15th and final week of Disciple History. And I'm going to call it, Where Do We Go From Here? Now, Pastor Dave said you can't end this on a down note. And considering the last 2 or 3 weeks, that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. Because the Disciples of Christ, like most mainline denominations, has not done well over the last 20 or 30 years. But some of you are familiar with the idea of 12-step groups. One of the ideas, this is at least from Alcoholics Anonymous, make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And so that's what we're going to try to do today, is look at where the Disciples of Christ as a denomination are headed, what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, and what we need to do. The first thing to know is that we're not in the boat alone. The problems that face us, a gentrification of our membership, a loss of membership, is going on in all the other mainline denominations, United Methodists, Presbyterians, ELCA, the UCC, the Episcopalians. We're all in the same boat. Unfortunately, sometimes that boat seems like the Titanic. I'm supposed to get a laugh there. And there are several reasons why this has happened. Part of it is that the mainline Protestant denominations over the last 30, 40, 50 years, the pastors, the leadership have shifted to the left. And the churches have to some extent. But oftentimes churchgoers in the United States, theologically, politically, have shifted to the right. And as I told the story about being in countryside, one night losing 4 elders over a theological issue. That happens, things like that happen to various churches. But the problem is, disciples have probably taken a bigger hit than most others. This is a sobering statistic. In the 10 years from 2008 to 2018, we went from 679,000 members to 380. 10 years, a 45% loss, if you can trust the numbers on the internet. Of course, the internet never lies. And that's strange. I mean, that's a lot, but it's strange because if I'm doing this, I have to talk about you never do anything without a mission statement and a vision statement now. Our identity is we are disciples of Christ, a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. We are part of the one body of Christ. We welcome all to the Lord's table as God has welcomed us. Now, there are 4 priorities of the disciples of Christ. This was established in 2001. Becoming a pro-reconciling / anti-racist church. Transformation of 1,000 current congregations by 2020. Leadership development necessary to realize these new and renewed congregations. And importantly, formation of 1,000 new congregations from 2001 to 2020. And apparently, at least according to the Disciple website, we established in 19 years 1,000 new congregations, 60% of which were still functioning. Yet despite that, we had a 45% loss of membership. And part of that is inexplicable. But part of it is for some reasons we're going to go over. Why have the disciples of Christ been hit more than the other mainline denominations? One of the first things is our identity. You know, if you say, what are you? And they say, I'm Presbyterian. What are you? I'm Episcopalian. What are we? I'm Christian. Part of it is, and this is not just related to us, this is related to Methodist, Presbyterians, UCC disciples, is we don't have the same brand loyalty of, say, an Episcopal congregation or a Lutheran congregation. Have you ever been to a Lutheran service? It's different. Have you ever been to an Episcopal service? It's different. Now, there's a little bit interchangeability among some denominations. My father grew up Presbyterian. When he married, he became a Methodist, and we moved to Gladstone. He became a disciple. There are plenty of disciple Presbyterian yoked churches. I tell a story. We all know Lloyd Gentry, our friend. You know, he was a 6-year interim at a disciple Presbyterian church. He always used to joke that he had 2 sets of glasses, you know, the little tiny readers. He goes, these are the Presbyterian glasses. And I've got the big ones that see the whole picture, the disciple glasses. But there are a lot of disciple Presbyterian yokes. There are Presbyterian Methodist yokes. There certainly can be yokes between disciples and UCC congregations because the ministers can go back and forth. There's a certain sense of interchangeability there. But that never happens with Lutherans or Episcopalians. They are different enough that they have a brand loyalty, a following that some of the others don't have. What does it take to run a church? People and money. Now certainly there are, in a church this age, we have a nice trust fund. We have some wealthy members. But the kind of money in most disciple congregation is nothing like, say, in a Presbyterian or particularly an Episcopal congregation, where they could literally, in some cases, live on forever on their interest. We don't have deep pockets. One of the problems we specifically have is, of the 7 mainline churches, which was the smallest to start with? Us. So, you know, if you're Methodist, if you lose 50% of 10 million, you still have 5 million. If you lose 50% of a million like we had at one time, you're down to 500,000. It's harder to keep the critical mass together when you're already smaller to start with. One of our problems is that we don't have a controlling authority. I think of my church in Hiawatha. Probably 10 years after I left, continuing loss of members. The pastor at that time, who had been one of my roommates at Bright, basically told them very correctly, it's time to get married. You need to merge with another. And there was a great church in the same county they could have done it with. They chose not to. And that, in some ways, started a death spiral for that congregation because they could no longer hire a full-time seminary-trained pastor. And United Methodists can force a yoke. The pastor, who's starting out may not like the fact that she or he has to preach at 3 different churches every Sunday. But they can keep a seminary-trained pastor employed for each of those churches. But the biggest problem we've got, what has killed us, is demographics. There is a relationship, not 100% correlation, between religion and politics. In 2000, 56% of white evangelicals, conservative Christians, identified as Republicans. In 2019, it was 78% identified as Republicans. As churches become theologically more conservative, they often become politically more conservative, and vice versa. Now that's not 100% true. You could find Democrats in a very conservative church, you could find a few Republicans in a very liberal church. But for the most part, and this only applies to white churches, that as congregations become in areas that are more politically conservative, they're often theologically conservative. And again, that does not apply in the African American community, where you have some very, very theologically conservative congregations that are made up almost entirely of Democrats. Do you follow me here? Here's the problem. You remember back in world history, they used to talk about the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia and Egypt. There's the Disciples of Christ Crescent. Pam, you were a grade school teacher. Did you ever try to draw states of the United States on the map?
No, but
I'm sure you would do a better job than I am. If you look at where we are big, North Carolina, that kind of looks like Virginia. That looks like West Virginia. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. That's a pathetic Missouri. Kansas. I think you can figure that out. And I lived in Texas, and that's the Disciples of Christ in Pennsylvania. I should make it like a little keystone. That's the Disciples of Christ Crescent. That's where, we have churches in California, Colorado, Wisconsin, Nebraska, but this is where our strength is. Now go back and let's talk about the more conservative communities become religiously, oftentimes their politics follow. Of these states in the last presidential election, how many were red and how many were blue? No, not all of them. And 3 are Pennsylvania barely, Virginia, and of course Illinois. Now, in some ways we have our demographics against us. What are the most liberal parts of the United States, politically and theologically? The coast. They say the most liberal state of all is Hawaii. Any idea of the number? There are less disciple churches in Hawaii than there are islands. There are 3 churches, one of which is a yoke with the Presbyterians. You think of, are there many states more liberal than Massachusetts? Any idea how many disciple churches are in Massachusetts? 1. How about New York? There are, I checked on the Northeastern Region's website, there were 46 churches in the state of New York as of 2021, but that's still on the books. If you look at them, half of them haven't made a report to the yearbook in 10, 15 years. So basically they are perhaps, not even functioning to the point that they can even turn a report in. In the Northeast, our churches are so few that Northeast, which is Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York, they're one region. And they can't even have their own regional minister. They have to share a regional minister with Pennsylvania and West Virginia. We have a big Park Avenue Christian church in New York City, but we are incredibly weak in the Northeast, some of the most liberal parts of America. Now, Methodists aren't, Presbyterians aren't, Episcopalians certainly aren't, Lutherans maybe, United Church of Christ is very strong there, but that part of our problem is our strength was primarily in conservative areas. And as the church veered to the left, if a church in Texas becomes open and affirming with LGBT issues, it's a lot different than, say, a church in New York City. That in so many ways we have our demography working against us. Make sense? Now let's look at it another way. How many people in this room, show of hands, have graduate degrees? That's almost everybody. What percentage of people in America have graduate degrees? 13%. And if you look at our congregation, the vast, vast majority of people went to college. And in most urban churches, suburban churches, and disciples, that's true. We attract an educated population. And you think about marketing, in the suburbs, that's not hard to get an educated population. But all the mainline churches are thinking people's churches. And you got plenty of people to draw from in the suburbs. But what about little towns? Disciples have traditionally had, a Disciples of Christ church in every little town in Missouri, Kansas, or wherever. Have you ever lived in a small town?
Liberty used to be.
Yeah, Liberty used to be, but not
that kind of small, though.
Not that kind of small.
You're talking like less than 50 kids graduating from the high school class.
Well, it's more than that now because they've consolidated the district so much that you may have one district for a whole county. But one of the big problems little towns face is the brain drain. Do you know of which I speak?
Kids graduate and then leave immediately.
The kids who have the brains, who have the ambition, leave and go to college. Do they come back? Rarely. Now, it's always the thing, people idealistic say, I want to get married, bring my kids back to a small town so they can have traditional values. That only works if you can get a decent job in a small town. And those can be few and far between. And so, disciples are appealing more and more to educated people. In our churches in little towns, there are less and less educated people. Now, there's probably enough for one big progressive church in town. But if you have a UCC church, a Presbyterian church, a Methodist church, a Disciple church, a Lutheran church, a Episcopal church, there probably are not enough people who that appeals to support all of them. That in rural markets, we're simply too cerebral for a lot of the population. And that sounds bad, but I think it's true. So, what do the disciples of Christ have going for us? I asked a group of ministers this and got so many answers that I really couldn't make sense out of it. The nature of churches are changing. If you think about, part of it is they're becoming more non-denominational. Everywhere you drive in the city, there's a new, usually a box church pops up, And they don't have a denominational name on it. Not even mainline. They're not Assembly of God or Southern Baptist. They're just, the Rock Church or the something church. And it seems like there's one on every corner. And the church is becoming less denominational. Obviously, in terms of music and liturgy, it's becoming less traditional. It was headed that way, and then something happened. What was it? COVID. And lots of churches suddenly made the transition to electronic ministries. I learned one thing during my tenure at Fairview Christian Church as interim. Be careful what you wish for. My first sermon there was on January 19, 2020. And I talked about how the church needed to be able to change. Never realizing that in the next 6 months, I would preside over more change than had happened in the first 60 plus years of that congregation. There is a new normal for everything, and that includes churches. The patterns of, how can I put this? Lack of traditional fellowship are probably going to continue. Less emphasis on tradition. I was reading, I don't know why I got on it, these big box non-denominational churches. I got on one of their websites a couple years ago. And of course they all have our statement of beliefs, creed. And this one church is like, oh my word. They said, we have 4 sacraments. Now, Catholics have 7 sacraments. Protestants have 2 sacraments. That's how it's been for 500 years, half a millennia. But this church says, we have 4 sacraments. You either have 2 or 7. But that's how the world's changing. People are not sticking to the traditional patterns. And that may be where the disciples of Christ have a distinct advantage. There's several reasons why we would do better than some other denominations. There will be more ethnic churches. There will be more home churches. There will be more non-traditional churches. There will be more churches with bivocational pastors. I thought I had another page here. Okay. And this is where we can excel. If you're an Episcopal church, can you have a service without a priest? No. Because the priest is the only one. You have communion every Sunday, and the priest is the only one that can do it. If he or she is not there, you don't have worship. So many of the churches have to have an ordained pastor present. Could we run without an ordained pastor? Now, there'd be a problem with marriages because that's controlled by the state. But other than that, a disciple church can get by without a pastor. Indeed, if you go back to Alexander Campbell, the whole idea was, of course I told you the story, he could believe that you shouldn't have a paid pastor because he married an incredibly wealthy woman, and what he was given supported him for the rest of his life. He didn't have to work. But we don't need an ordained pastor. It'd be nice if we had a seminary trained pastor, but in little home churches, we can excel. And again, I told you the story about the church that had 4 sacraments. Well, nobody has 4 sacraments. But people are thinking outside the box. If you came to a disciples church and said, can you have 4 sacraments? Could we? We don't have any rules. We could have 2, 3, 4, 5, as many sacraments as you want. Now, it's probably not going to happen. But we have, as the world moves away from traditional standards, we probably have an advantage because we don't have a creed. Now, and we have an advantage because we don't tell people how they can interpret the Bible. Now, I have a story here. Most of you are parents. How many of you ever gave your kids a puppy or a kitten? Now, I'm betting before you did, you had the talk. That went something like this. Well, you know, having a kitten, having a puppy is a big responsibility. And so you're going to have to step up and take care of this animal. Do the kids ever do it? No. But everybody has that talk. I certainly heard it from my folks. But because with privilege comes responsibility. We have the privilege that we don't have a denomination, a creed that says, this you must believe. But what's the responsibility for that? We have to be able to articulate, okay, you don't follow the Apostles' Creed, then how do you know what you believe? There's a responsibility. If you're going to claim the freedom, you need to be able to justify, this is why I believe what I believe. And so there's a responsibility there. I think you're going to see the disciple future as less and less churches in small towns. There will be suburban, nice churches like this that survive. There will be some that do not survive. There will be probably a plethora of the kind of churches we talked about here, non-traditional ones. Home churches, small churches, churches with bivocational pastors, ethnic congregations. We're going to see that more and more among the disciples of Christ. And I guess I'm going to cut it off there. Any questions?